This video is going to explain quite a lot of content from this topic, but it mostly all comes under the category of talking about blood vessels and blood, but I will touch on a little bit to do with blood clotting and a little bit to do with the white blood cells and the immune system, but they're things that you will likely go over again at a later point in a little bit more detail. The first part then, looking at the blood vessels. So this is a great photo. This is a photo taken with a light microscope. So you can see quite a lot of the structures of an artery here. So the first label that I've put on here, the lumen, so that refers to the inside space of any blood vessel, not specific to an artery. When we talk about the size of the lumen, we're talking about how much space there is within the blood vessel. Arteries then also have a very thick layer of muscle and elastic tissue, which you can see now. If you zoom in very closely, you can see that it looks slightly different than the layer that's on the outside of it. Endothelium is a word that refers to the inside lining of cells of any blood vessel, not just specifically to arteries. Arteries are identifiable though because their endothelium's got this kind of wavy pattern to it. And then finally the outer layer, which you can see if you look closely as being a different kind of texture, almost to the muscle and elastic tissue. So that's going to be the outermost layer. Features then of an artery. Now this is relative. So the lumen is narrow, but that's really relative to a vein. Not really compared to a capillary. Compared to a capillary, arteries will have a larger lumen. They will have a thick layer of muscle and elastic tissue, which as I said before, is visible on that picture. And they also have a relatively thick, this outer layer that is also very tough and very fibrous. We'll talk a bit more about the functions of these features in a second. Thinking about the functions then, so the fact that the lumen, the inside space of an artery, is narrower than in a vein, contributes towards maintaining a high blood pressure. Now, blood in the arteries is coming from the heart, it's going to a destination. It's usually, other than the pulmonary arteries, taking oxygen. It needs to get to its destination. And so being able to squeeze that blood through a narrow lumen does help to maintain a high blood pressure to get the blood where it needs to be. Then that thick muscle and elastic tissue, in part, the muscle can contract, it can constrict, it can narrow the blood vessel to raise the blood pressure if it's starting to drop as the blood is getting further from the heart, which again contributes towards maintaining a high blood pressure in the arteries all the way to their destination. And then the elastic tissue, in the same way that an elastic band will stretch and then kind of snap back, it will stretch and recoil, is that the elastic tissue in an artery does exactly that. So it can stretch as a surge of blood passes into the artery from the heart, and then it can recoil to return the artery back to its original shape. And really what that's going to do is that it smooths out the surges or the waves of blood, because blood is leaving the heart in surges. With each contraction of the ventricle, the blood is leaving the heart, and that kind of irregularity in blood pressure is passed on into the arteries. And so the elastic tissue does smooth that out a little bit. And then finally, that tough fibrous outer layer is going to withstand the high blood pressure. The arteries, the walls of the arteries do have to withstand extremely high blood pressure, and that tough outer layer really helps to achieve that. Looking then at veins, so relative to arteries, they have a wider lumen. This picture here is really getting across a different point that we'll talk about in a second, but veins do have a wider lumen. They also have a thinner layer of muscle and elastic tissue, so they'll have less muscle, less elastic tissue in the walls of a vein. Veins, totally differently from arteries, have valves. So that's similar to the structures that we saw in the blood vessels of the heart, okay, in the previous week's lesson. So it's going to again have a very similar function here than it did there. The wider lumen of a vein, so it's not really possible for the veins to maintain a high blood pressure, because the blood is coming from the capillaries as it goes into the vein and it's going towards the heart often against gravity, often at a very low blood pressure. So it's not really about maintaining blood pressure, but it's about reducing the resistance to the blood flow. So by having these nice wide open lumens in the veins, is that there's less kind of the blood cells bouncing off against the sides of the blood vessels, and so there's going to be much less resistance. Because the lower pressure, there just doesn't need to be as much muscle and elastic. There being less doesn't serve a function directly. It's just not necessary to have more. And then lastly on this section, the valves, the big thing there is about preventing backflow of blood. So because the pressure is very low, you don't have high pressure just carrying the blood through the blood vessels. In an artery, the blood is just going to be flowing from where there's a higher pressure to where there's a slightly lower pressure, and that's going to keep pushing the blood through the arteries. You don't really have that in a vein because the pressure is so low, so you need to be able to stop the blood from kind of flowing back the wrong way. Another thing that contributes towards helping to keep the blood moving in the veins is that where veins pass through your arms and your legs particularly, is that when you're moving, the muscles surrounding the veins are going to contract and they're going to squeeze on the veins. They're going to just put a bit of pressure onto the veins, which will help to return the blood back to the heart. Really, really important, particularly in the lower legs, which is why sometimes people can have very poor blood flow in their lower legs if they've been sitting for a long time, such as in kind of long flights. It's why they encourage you to get up and move around in that kind of situation. Okay, so yeah, I've just added here as a summary then, arteries are taking blood away from the heart at a high pressure. So all of those features, all of those functions, it's all about maintaining high blood pressure, withstanding high blood pressure, getting the blood to its destination. Veins, on the other hand, are taking blood back towards the heart at a lower pressure. So it's all about being able to keep the blood still flowing in the correct direction, but dealing with this feature of the blood having a very low pressure. Our third type of blood vessel then is the capillaries. Now capillaries are small compared to the other blood vessels that we've looked at, and you can see in the picture there that you can even see individual cells there, and in this diagram at the bottom. So the only layer that the capillaries have is the endothelium. So that's only the very innermost layer of cells. So they don't have any of the outer layers. There's no muscle, no elastic tissue, no fibrous outer layer, none of that at all. They only have the innermost cell layer. So the walls are therefore very thin and only made up of just one cell in thickness, which is great because it allows really efficient exchange of substances. So that's in combination. A lot of the time that's going to be diffusion, just because there's going to be a very short diffusion distance from within the blood vessel to outside of the blood vessel, but also because it's only one layer of cells that there are actually very small holes or very small pores between the cells of the endothelium, which does mean that fluid can move from the capillary out into the tissue, but that also diffusion can happen really efficiently as well. And that's going to be relevant everywhere where we have capillaries, both near aspiring tissues, but also, as you've seen before, in the lungs. Capillaries, it's all about bringing the blood, whether that's bringing the red blood cells, whether that's bringing something else that's another part of the blood, as close as possible to the tissues. Okay, this next page then we can see we've got similar diagrams for all three, just to have a think about in comparison with each other, because a lot of this is comparative, thinking about how they're different to each other. I'm just going to add this note here that they're not to scale. So the capillary on here looks very large. It wouldn't be, it would be much smaller than both of the other two. So I'll just go through this quickly. So we've got narrow lumen, we've got a thick layer of muscle and elastic tissue. We've got a relatively thick outer layer as well. And then for veins, they've got a much wider lumen, a thinner layer of muscle and elastic tissue, a thinner outer layer. Not necessary to have a thick outer layer because there's just not the pressure that needs to be withstood. And then just to highlight them there, our really big difference between arteries and veins is in veins the presence of valves to prevent backflow. And then for the capillaries, so the wall of the capillaries is just a single cell thickness. It's important not to describe capillaries as being one cell thick, but that the capillary wall is just one cell thick. And then they're going to have a narrow lumen, certainly relative to the other two. The lumen of a capillary is about the diameter of one red blood cell, so that red blood cells pass through about one at a time. And that all helps to make sure that the red blood cells move nice and slowly through the capillary, so that there's loads of opportunity for exchange. Just a quick colour code. You'll be able to easily check these against this or against the PowerPoint as well, but it's just nice to have it summarised. One extra thing there, as you can see, is that the arteries are where we can detect the pulse. So that's because the pulse itself, what you're feeling is the surge or the wave of blood from the heart. By the time the blood's in veins, it's not passing in waves anymore. It's just being collected from the capillaries. So we can only detect the pulse in an artery. And it's got to be somewhere where the artery is close to the surface of the skin. Generally where you've got an artery that's kind of over the top of a bone, but close to the surface of the skin, which is why in the wrist is somewhere where we can often feel the pulse. Another one there, just as a good point for comparison, is that arteries generally do contain oxygenated blood, but there is an exception because we have got the pulmonary artery, which will be carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs, and then same with the vein, that the pulmonary vein will be carrying oxygenated blood back from the lungs. And again, diffusion, really important for this one too.